Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. We've got quite the discussion ahead for you today, focusing on the increasingly tense situation between the United States and Venezuela. In particular, we'll be breaking down the latest developments surrounding the situation, spanning domestic and international borders that involves deportations, oil tariffs, and geopolitical maneuvering.
Now, to kick things off, let's talk about the latest news on the deportation front. As of late last week, the Trump administration has made an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking it for permission to resume deportations of Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador under an 18th century wartime law while a court fight continues. Now, if permission is granted, this could potentially send thousands of Venezuelan nationals back to their home country, even amidst the ongoing humanitarian crisis that is taking place there.
This emergency appeal to the High Court follows a rejection of the Republican administration's plea to the Federal Appeals Court in Washington. By a 2-1 vote, a panel of appellate judges left in place an order temporarily prohibiting deportations of the migrants under the rarely used Alien Enemies Act. In its filing late last week, the U.S. Justice Department says that this case presents the question of who decides how to conduct sensitive national security-related operations, the president or the judiciary.
And in this case, the department had written, the Constitution supplies a clear answer, the president, and the republic cannot afford a different choice.
Now, before we go deeper into the issue, let's take a step back to talk about the case in point here. Earlier in March, the U.S. government used an 18th century wartime law to deport more than 200 Venezuelan immigrants earlier this month to El Salvador, where they were immediately transferred to the country's maximum security gang prison. Basically, long story short, sources familiar with the matter told ABC News that President Donald Trump's administration made a calculated decision to ignore a judge's directive to turn around 2 flights containing hundreds of alleged Venezuelan gang members.
Yeah, and a bit of context about these gang members. They belong to a gang called Tren de Aragua, which began in the 2000s in a notorious penitentiary in north-central Venezuela, where gang leaders at one point had their own zoo, nightclub, and bank inside the prison. Now, what distinguishes the gang from other larger criminal organizations is the ease and quickness with which it has spread over a large portion of the American continent. And that's a movement experts say is tied to the mass exodus of Venezuelans.
All right. So the verbal order from the chief judge of the Washington, D.C. District Court, James Boasberg, explicitly told the government to turn around any aircraft that had already departed the country if it was still in the air.
Now, this is where the lines get a little blurry. The line between arguments in support of a claimed right to disobey court orders and outright defiance has become delicate and fine, and raises the question of whether the latest clash between President Trump and the judiciary amounts to a constitutional crisis. Legal scholars that were interviewed by the New York Times say that that is no longer the right inquiry and that Trump is already undercutting the separation of powers at the heart of the constitutional system. So then the right question now is how it will transform the nation.
Yeah, so let's take a look at their analysis of the case, and we're talking about the New York Times, starting with Jamal Green, a law professor at Columbia. He says if anyone is being detained or removed based on the administration's assertion that it can do so without judicial review or due process, and that the president is asserting dictatorial power and constitutional crisis doesn't capture the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, another law professor, this time from the University of Chicago, Aziz Haq, he says assessing whether a given development is a constitutional crisis is, quote, generally unhelpful. I think it's more useful to say that this is moving us into a completely different kind of constitutional order, one that's no longer characterized by laws that bind officials and that can be enforced, and that the law, in other words, becomes a tool to harm enemies but not to bind those who govern. That is quite a different constitutional order from the one that we've had for a long time.
We've also heard from the lawyer representing the government at the hearing, and he had another argument that Judge Boasberg was powerless to order the planes to turn around once they had left American airspace, and that assertion was also labeled unconvincing by many legal experts.
All right, and this isn't just a routine deportation issue. It's tied up, in the broader context of U.S. foreign policy toward Venezuela, particularly under the Trump administration's America First approach. So that begs the question, what exactly does an America First approach to Venezuela look like? Now, the world may be about to find out, and that brings us to the oil side of things.
Yeah, so the U.S. government has notified foreign partners of Venezuela's state oil company of the imminent cancellation of authorizations that allow them to export Venezuelan oil and byproducts. That's according to sources close to the decision by President Donald Trump's administration, as it ratchets up economic and diplomatic pressure on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
Now, according to reports, the companies that have received licenses and comfort letters from Washington include Spain's Repsol, Italy's Eni, France's Morel and Prom, India's Reliance Industries, and U.S. Global Oil Terminals. And based on sources and vessel tracking data, most companies had already suspended imports of Venezuelan oil following Trump's executive order declaring that any country buying oil or gas from Venezuela will pay a 25% tariff on trades with the U.S. starting 2nd April.
And one could argue that the timing couldn't be more critical. On one hand, you've got this looming deportation crisis, and on the other hand, the U.S. is imposing tariffs and sanctions, making it even more difficult for Venezuela to rebuild its struggling economy. And we've seen some of these moves before, but it seems the intensity of them is growing.
So perhaps you might be wondering why there's interest in Venezuela's ongoing descent into economic and political chaos. And that's because Venezuela, home to the world's largest oil reserves, is a petrostate. Since it was discovered in the country in the 1920s, oil has taken Venezuela on an exhilarating but dangerous boom and bust ride that offers lessons for other resource-rich states.
So very quickly, what is a petrostate? Petrostate is an informal term used to describe a country with several interrelated attributes. Government income is deeply reliant on the export of oil and natural gas. Economic and political power are highly concentrated in an elite minority, and political institutions are weak and unaccountable, and corruption is widespread.
Now, you might think that if a country has vast amounts of oil as a resource, then it must be rich, right?
You would think so, but grim indicators in Venezuela's case is oil dependence. In recent years, oil exports have financed almost 2/3 of the government's budget. Estimates for 2024 place this figure slightly lower at 58%.
Yep, we also have falling production. Starved of adequate investment and maintenance, oil output has continued to generally decline, hitting its lowest level in decades, but exports increased by 12% in 2023, due in part to an easing of U.S. sanctions on the country's oil and gas sector. There's also the third factor here is turbulent economy. So although Venezuela's economy grew 9% last year and 5% the year before, it's worth noting that its GDP shrank by roughly 3/4 between 2014 and 2021.
Not to mention the soaring debt. Venezuela has an estimated debt burden of $150 billion or higher. And of course, there's hyperinflation. Annual inflation skyrocketed to just over 130,000% in 2018, and though it has since slowed, it remained at 190% in 2023, and that's according to the central bank.
So on the contrary, instead of being rich, petrostates are thought to be vulnerable to what economists call the Dutch disease, a term coined during the 1970s after the Netherlands discovered natural gas in the North Sea. Petrostate economies can be highly vulnerable to unpredictable swings in global energy prices and capital flights. So if you think about it, what a persistently low oil price does to oil-rich countries is likened to what a long cold winter does to ordinary folks like you and me, Audrey.
Yeah, in an afflicted country, a resource boom attracts large inflows of foreign capital, which leads to an appreciation of the local currency and a boost for imports that are now comparatively cheaper. This sucks labor and capital away from other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture and manufacturing, areas which economists say are more important for growth and competitiveness. As these labor-intensive export industries lag, unemployment could go up and the country could develop an unhealthy dependence on the export of natural resources.
Now, according to the Brookings Institute, the Dutch disease was thought to be transmitted primarily via exchange rate movements following a large inflow of foreign currency, for example, due to a natural resource discovery, a surge in commodity prices, remittances, foreign aid, or investment. But new research has revealed that catching this disease is much easier than previously thought. That is, it can even happen without real appreciation of the currency, just simply from the inequality in the distribution of natural resource rents.
Since petrostates depend more on export income and less on taxes, there are often weak ties between the government and its citizens. So one could argue that the so-called resource curse also takes a toll on governance. So is there a path away from the oil curse?
Now, if a country strikes oil or another resource before it develops its state infrastructure, the curse is much harder to avoid. But research has found that there are remedial measures that low-income as well as developing countries can try, provided they are willing. For example, according to an expert on economic development, Columbia University's Jeffrey Sachs, a government's overarching objective should be to use the oil earnings in a responsible manner to, quote, finance outlays on public goods that serve as the platform for private investment and long-term growth.
Sachs also suggested that this can be done financially with broad-based investing in international assets or physically by building infrastructure and educating workers. And he emphasized that transparency is essential in all of this.
Anyway, to conclude, analysts anticipate that the global shift from fossil fuel energy to renewables like solar and wind will force petrostates to diversify their economies. But given the scale of Venezuela's economic and political collapse over the last decade, economic diversification looks to be an especially difficult climb. So we leave you with this question. Will developing countries that are also petrostates be a thing of the past in time to come? And can they mitigate the dangerous influence that resource wealth can have on them? Well, it seems only time will tell.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.